March 15, 1957, 10:33 p.m., the Cotton Club sat silent except for the sound of breaking glass and the wet crunch of bone on mahogany. Vincent Caruso lay on the floor of Duke Ellington's private dressing room, his face a landscape of blood and regret. His left eye was swollen shut, his nose was definitely broken, and standing over him, breathing heavy, wiping blood from his knuckles, was Bumpy Johnson. Not a tall man, barely clearing 5'9", but in that moment he seemed like something out of mythology, something violent and ancient. Vincent had made a mistake, a big one. He'd thought that because his uncle was connected to the Genovese family, because he had muscle and money, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences, he could walk into the Cotton Club on the night of Duke Ellington's private performance and do whatever he wanted. He'd thought wrong. What Vincent didn't understand, what most men in New York in 1957 didn't understand, was that Harlem operated under different rules. In Manhattan, in the outer boroughs, power meant bullets and bodies, and the kind of fear that made men look over their shoulders for the rest of their lives. In Harlem, power meant something else entirely. It meant being the man that mothers told their sons about. It meant being the kind of presence that made a room settle down just because you walked through the door. It meant being the man who stood between the people and the wolves, and that man was Bumpy Johnson. The story that night, the one that would echo through Harlem for decades, really began 3 weeks earlier at a money laundering operation. The Genovese family ran out of a numbers joint on 125th Street. Vincent Caruso was 28 years old, with slicked back hair, a tailored suit that cost more than most men made in a month, and absolutely no sense. He was the nephew of Tony Genovese, a captain in the Genovese crime family, and he'd been given a simple job: keep the money moving. Make sure the numbers game stayed profitable. Don't cause problems. 3 weeks of watching other men earn respect while he watched from the sidelines had made him restless. 3 weeks of being treated like an errand boy by men in their 40s and 50s had convinced him he needed to establish himself. He needed to do something that would make the organization notice him, something that would make him legendary. What he decided to do was stupid. He was going to take something from Bumpy Johnson. Not money, not territory, something worse. He was going to take respect. He was going to prove that Bumpy Johnson wasn't untouchable, that the Genovese family, the power he represented, could do whatever they wanted in Harlem, and Bumpy couldn't do anything about it. The target he chose was Duke Ellington, not because he hated Duke, not because he had any real beef with the greatest musician in America, but because Duke Ellington was Bumpy Johnson's closest friend. They'd known each other for nearly a decade. Duke played at the clubs Bumpy owned. They ate dinner together. They were seen in public together constantly. To Harlem, they weren't just friends. They were brothers. And Vincent figured, correctly, that if he humiliated Duke Ellington, if he made Duke look small, if he did it publicly, then Bumpy Johnson would have to respond. And if Bumpy responded with violence, then Vincent could claim self-defense. He could claim that Bumpy was the aggressor. He could use the legal system, his family's connections, his money, to turn the tables. It was a perfect plan. Perfect in the way that only plans made by young men with no wisdom ever are. Duke Ellington in 1957 was at the height of his powers. He was 58 years old, internationally famous, a genius who could sit down at a piano and make music that changed people's souls. He was performing a private concert at the Cotton Club on the night of March 15th for an exclusive crowd, 30 people, maybe 40. Business owners, politicians, artists, the kind of crowd that paid premium prices to hear Duke play in an intimate setting. Duke was in his element that night. He wore a tuxedo so perfect it looked like it had been painted onto his body. His fingers danced across the keys. The music that came out wasn't just sound. It was memory and longing and joy and pain all mixed together in a way that only Duke could create. The room was absolutely silent except for the music. Every person there was lost in it, transported. That's when Vincent Caruso walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there. Security at the Cotton Club was tight, especially for Duke's private performances. But Vincent had paid off one of the kitchen staff, slipped him $200 to leave a side door unlocked. The security team wasn't expecting trouble. Why would they? This was Duke Ellington. This was the Cotton Club, one of the safest places in Harlem, because Bumpy Johnson had made it safe. Vincent walked straight to where Duke was sitting at the piano. The music stopped. Duke's fingers froze above the keys. Everyone in the room turned to look. Vincent was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable. It was a predator's smile. "Hey, Duke," Vincent said, his voice loud and disrespectful in the quiet room. "I heard you were some kind of genius. I heard you could play anything. Is that right?" Duke was a dignified man. He'd spent his whole life in entertainment, dealing with every kind of drunk and jackass that money could attract. He knew how to handle situations like this with grace. He started to turn back to the piano, decided to ignore the interruption. But Vincent wasn't done. Nah, Duke, I'm talking to you. You think you're too good to answer a man? You think you're above me?" The room had gone very still. People were starting to realize that this wasn't a normal interruption. This was something deliberate. This was a challenge. "You know what I think, Duke? I think you're a show pony. I think you're all flash and no substance. I think I could probably play better than you with my eyes closed, and I don't even play piano." The insults kept coming, getting progressively crueler and more specific. Vincent was trying to provoke Duke into a fight. He was trying to make Duke angry, make him lose his composure, make him look like a fool in front of these important people. But Duke refused. He simply sat at the piano and began to play again. He played as if Vincent wasn't there. He played as if no one was there but him and the music. And that infuriated Vincent more than any physical reaction could have. Vincent reached out and slammed his hand down on the piano keys, creating a horrible, discordant sound that cut through the room like a knife. Then he grabbed Duke by the jacket and yanked him up from the bench. Duke, 70 years old, dignified, legendary, was suddenly being manhandled by a 28-year-old punk who thought he could humiliate him. For just a second, Duke looked like he might fight back. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightened, and then he didn't. He let himself be pulled away from the piano. He didn't swing, he didn't resist. He simply looked at Vincent with disappointment, the same look a father might give a son who'd failed him. And then Duke looked at one of the security guards. "Call Bumpy," he said quietly. "Tell him what happened here. Tell him I'm going to wait downstairs." Security escorted Duke out of the room. The other guests sat in stunned silence. Vincent stood there with his hands still outstretched, laughing like he'd just won the greatest victory of his life. He'd done it. He'd humiliated Duke Ellington. He'd shown Harlem that the Genovese family didn't respect anyone, not even legends. By tomorrow morning, everyone would know about this. By next week, Bumpy Johnson would either have to respond with violence and face legal consequences, or he'd have to do nothing and lose face forever. Vincent had created a situation where Bumpy couldn't win, or so he thought. What Vincent didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Bumpy Johnson had already started moving the moment Duke called. Bumpy was at his office above Small's Paradise Jazz Club when the message came through. He was sitting with Illinois Gordon, his most trusted lieutenant, going over numbers from the week's operations. The message came through one of the bartenders who worked for Duke. Duke had been disrespected at the Cotton Club, a young guy connected to the Genovese family. Bumpy listened to the full report without saying anything. When the bartender was done, Bumpy simply nodded and sent him away. Illinois was already starting to plan the retaliation. "We can find him tonight. We can make an example. We can put out the word that nobody disrespects Duke Ellington and walks away." But Bumpy held up a hand. "No, sit down." Illinois sat. Bumpy walked to the window and looked out over Harlem. The streets were busy with the nighttime crowd. People heading to clubs, to restaurants, to back rooms where business was conducted and fortunes were made. "This is more important than showing strength," Bumpy said quietly. "This is about showing that we think. This is about showing that we don't react like animals. This is about showing that we're smarter than the men who think they can push us around." Illinois didn't understand yet, but he would. Bumpy had a gift for understanding people, for seeing what they wanted before they even knew they wanted it. He understood Vincent's psychology immediately. The kid was young, arrogant, trying to prove something to his family. He'd created a situation that he thought was foolproof. Bumpy was going to walk into a trap that Vincent had set, with witnesses everywhere, and Vincent was going to be able to claim self-defense. That was Vincent's whole plan. But Bumpy wasn't going to let the situation play out the way Vincent expected. He was going to do something completely different. Bumpy spent the next 3 days watching Vincent. He had people follow him. He learned where Vincent went, who he met with, what his routine was. He learned that Vincent spent most evenings at a club called the Paradise Club on 116th Street. a place that catered to young hustlers and connected guys trying to prove themselves. He learned that Vincent had rented a penthouse apartment on 125th Street that he was very proud of. He learned that Vincent had a girl, a dancer named Rosie, who worked at the Apollo Theater, that Vincent was seeing on the side. He learned that Vincent had a specific weakness for a particular brand of expensive scotch, and that he always drank it at the Paradise Club on Thursday nights. Thursday came around. Bumpy didn't go to the Paradise Club himself. Instead, he sent a messenger, a man nobody would pay attention to, a man who worked as a janitor at several businesses in Harlem. The janitor walked into the Paradise Club at around 10 p.m. and approached Vincent, who was sitting at a back table with 3 of his associates. The janitor leaned down and whispered something in Vincent's ear. Vincent's face went pale. He excused himself immediately and left the club without finishing his drink. The message had been simple. Duke Ellington is at the Cotton Club right now. Bumpy Johnson is here too. And Bumpy says he wants to talk to you about respect. The trick was that Bumpy wasn't actually at the Cotton Club. This was a test. This was designed to see if Vincent would come. If Vincent was stupid enough to show up looking for Bumpy, looking to continue whatever confrontation he thought he was building, then Vincent would prove himself to be exactly what Bumpy had suspected. Young, reckless, and convinced of his own invincibility, Vincent rushed to the Cotton Club. He arrived in the back of a cab, his heart pounding. He expected to find Bumpy Johnson waiting for him, ready for a confrontation. What he found instead was Bumpy standing in the main room of the club, completely alone, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, no muscle, no backup, just Bumpy. Looking at the smaller man, Vincent's confidence came rushing back. This was going to be easy. This was going to be the moment he became a legend, the moment he finally proved himself. So Vincent made his move. He charged at Bumpy, throwing a wild punch, trying to use his size and his youth and his superior physical conditioning to overwhelm the older man. What happened next happened very fast. Bumpy moved to the side with barely any effort. Vincent's punch sailed past him and connected with nothing but air. As Vincent stumbled forward, off balance, Bumpy moved. Later, the witnesses would have different accounts of what happened. Some said Bumpy had a razor blade in his hand. Some said he used his fist. Some said he used something else entirely. What was certain was that within 30 seconds, Vincent was on the ground. His face was a ruin. His eye was swollen shut. His nose was broken. His mouth was bleeding so badly he could barely breathe. The devastating part was that Bumpy didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Like a teacher disappointed in a student who knew better but did it anyway. Bumpy walked over to the bar and ordered a drink. He sat down and sipped it slowly while Vincent lay bleeding on the floor. "You're going to tell your uncle something?" Bumpy said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "You're going to tell Tony Genovese that Duke Ellington is untouchable. You're going to tell him that anyone who disrespects Duke is going to have a very bad time? You're going to tell him that what happened to you right now, this is mercy? This is me being nice. If you ever, and I mean ever, go near Duke Ellington again, if you ever even look at him disrespectfully, if you ever speak his name without absolute reverence, what happens next won't be as gentle. Do you understand me?" Vincent, barely conscious, bleeding everywhere, nodded. "Good," Bumpy said. "Now, get out of here. Get back in a cab. Go to a hospital. Tell the doctors you got mugged. Tell the cops you don't remember who did it. And, most importantly, tell your family that this is over. Tell them that Bumpy Johnson doesn't want war. Bumpy Johnson just wants respect. That's all I've ever wanted. Is that clear?" Vincent nodded again. He managed to get to his feet. Stumbling, barely able to walk, he made his way out of the Cotton Club and disappeared into the Harlem night. By the next morning, the story had spread through every connected family in New York. Not just the Genovese family, but the Luciano family, the Colombo family, the Gambino family, the Lucchese family. They all heard the same story. Bumpy Johnson had beaten Vincent Caruso half to death for disrespecting Duke Ellington. But it wasn't the violence that impressed them. It was the psychology. It was the fact that Bumpy had understood Vincent's plan, had seen through it, and had executed a response that was so decisive that it couldn't be questioned or challenged. Vincent had tried to create a situation where Bumpy was trapped. Instead, Bumpy had created a situation where Vincent was exposed as nothing more than a foolish kid with delusions of grandeur. The Genovese family called an emergency meeting. Tony Genovese himself presided over it, and he was furious. Not at Bumpy, at Vincent for being stupid, for dragging the family's name into something they had nothing to do with, for creating a situation where the family would have to back down or face Bumpy Johnson's wrath. Tony made a decision that day that reverberated through the New York underworld for years. He sent a message to Bumpy Johnson. The message was simple. Vincent Caruso is no longer with our organization. We disavow him. He acted without authorization. And more importantly, anyone in our family who disrespects Duke Ellington again will be dealt with by us, not by you. The Genovese family respected Duke Ellington. The Genovese family respected Bumpy Johnson. And anyone who couldn't understand that simple fact was an idiot who would be removed. Within a week, Vincent Caruso had left New York entirely. He'd used his remaining money to buy a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. He spent the rest of his life working odd jobs, telling the story of how he'd gotten his face broken by Bumpy Johnson to anyone who would listen, and most people wouldn't. The story he told was always the same. He said he'd gotten drunk and stupid. He said he'd disrespected a friend of Bumpy Johnson's and paid the price. He said that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. Bumpy Johnson was something else entirely, something that existed outside of normal morality, outside of normal power structures. Bumpy Johnson was a force of nature. By the time Vincent died in 1989, old and bitter and alone in a cheap apartment in Long Beach, the story had become legend. Bumpy Johnson had actually died in 1968 and had been dead for more than 20 years. But in Vincent's mind, Bumpy was still alive. Bumpy was still standing in that cotton club, with blood on his knuckles and disappointment in his eyes, teaching lessons that couldn't be unlearned. Duke Ellington found out what happened to Vincent within hours. He didn't ask for any details. He didn't want to know how badly Vincent had been hurt. He simply made a phone call to Bumpy and invited him to dinner at his apartment the next night. They ate together, the two of them, and Duke played piano for Bumpy while they drank wine and talked about music and power and respect. Duke never mentioned Vincent. Bumpy never mentioned Vincent. They didn't need to. The situation had been handled. The lesson had been delivered. The world had been put back in order. That's really what it came down to. In the end, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't just a gangster trying to make money and accumulate power like every other hustler in New York. Bumpy Johnson was a man who understood that power came from being smarter than everyone else. Power came from thinking 3 moves ahead. Power came from creating situations where your enemies made mistakes while you remained perfect, untouchable, in control. The razor blade, if there was a razor blade, was almost beside the point. The real weapon that Bumpy Johnson used on Vincent Caruso was intelligence. It was the ability to read people, to understand what they wanted, to predict how they would behave. It was the ability to turn their own plans against them. It was the ability to make sure that when justice was delivered, it was absolute and undeniable. The story of Vincent Caruso became a lesson in Harlem that was passed down for generations. Mothers told their sons about it. Fathers told their sons about it. Hustlers told other hustlers about it. The message was always the same. Don't disrespect Duke Ellington. Don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Don't think that because you have money or connections or family power that you're untouchable. Because there's always someone smarter than you. There's always someone who sees things coming before they happen. There's always someone who understands that real power isn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most willing to use violence. Real power is about being the smartest. Real power is about knowing what your enemy is going to do before they do it. Years later, in the 1970s, long after Bumpy had died, long after Duke had died, young men in Harlem would still tell the story of the night a mafioso tried to humiliate Duke Ellington and learned what it meant to earn Bumpy Johnson's displeasure. They'd tell it in the clubs and the bars and on the street corners, in the back rooms where business was conducted, in the apartments where young hustlers gathered to dream about power and respect. They'd embellish it, add details, make it more dramatic with each retelling. The story took on a life of its own, evolving with every generation that passed it down. By the time the story had been told 1,000 times, it had taken on mythological proportions, had become something bigger than the event itself, had become a parable about the nature of power and the consequence of arrogance. Some versions had Bumpy using a straight razor that cut so fast it was invisible, so fast that Vincent didn't even realize he'd been cut until he tried to move and felt the pain. Some versions had Bumpy moving through the room like a ghost, striking from angles that seemed impossible, leaving marks that appeared on Vincent's body with no clear explanation for how they got there. Some versions had Bumpy using his bare hands with such precision that he broke every bone in Vincent's face without striking him more than twice. Surgical in his approach, clinical in his execution. Some versions had Bumpy standing over Vincent's bloodied body and reciting poetry about the importance of respect, about the sacred nature of honor, about the way that power had to be earned rather than inherited. In some tellings, witnesses swore they heard Bumpy quote Shakespeare. In others, they said he recited verses from the Bible. Verses about rendering unto Caesar and about the meek inheriting the earth. Some said he simply stood there in silence, letting the blood and the broken bones speak for themselves. The details changed with each retelling, mutated as they passed from mouth to mouth, transformed by the natural human tendency to make stories bigger and more dramatic than they actually were. But the core of the story remained the same, unchanged and unchangeable. A young man thought he could disrespect Duke Ellington. He thought he could use Duke to humiliate Bumpy. He thought he could create a trap that was foolproof, a situation where Bumpy would either have to respond with violence and face legal consequences, or do nothing and lose face forever. He thought he'd found the weakness in Bumpy's armor, the one thing that would bring the great man to his knees. And Bumpy Johnson had shown him, with absolute finality, with undeniable clarity, that he was wrong, that he'd misunderstood the game entirely, that he'd been playing checkers while Bumpy played chess. What Vincent Caruso never understood, what he couldn't have understood if someone had tried to explain it to him, was that in Harlem in 1957, respect wasn't just a concept or an abstract idea, it was the entire foundation of the social order. It was the only thing that stood between civilization and chaos, between order and anarchy, between a community that took care of its own and a neighborhood that descended into violence and despair. Bumpy Johnson had spent his entire life building and maintaining a system based on respect. He'd constructed it brick by brick, situation by situation, one difficult lesson at a time. He'd made sure that the people of Harlem understood one simple truth. He would protect them. He would take care of them. He would stand between them and the wolves who wanted to devour their community. The wolves who saw Harlem as nothing but a resource to be exploited and extracted. But that protection, that care, that leadership, all of it was dependent on one single thing: respect. Without the understanding that Bumpy Johnson's word was absolute and that crossing him had consequences, without the universal acknowledgement that he was the man in charge and that everyone else was simply living in his world, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards in a windstorm. The hustlers would start stealing from each other. The numbers runners would begin to cheat. The young men trying to prove themselves would start challenging Bumpy's authority. The Italian mob would see weakness and would move in with overwhelming force. And within weeks, Harlem would be a war zone. And so, when Vincent Caruso tried to take that respect, when he tried to show Harlem that Bumpy's word didn't mean anything, that his protection couldn't be trusted, that his authority was hollow and could be challenged by any kid with enough arrogance and family connections, Bumpy had to respond in a way that was immediate, decisive, and undeniable. Bumpy had to show not just Vincent's Uncle Tony Genovese, but everyone in Harlem, everyone in New York, everyone in the entire underworld from Boston to Miami, that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson had a price. And that price wasn't measured in money. It wasn't something that could be negotiated or paid off with a bribe or a favor. That price was everything Vincent had: his dignity, his health, his future, his place in his own family, his ability to walk down the street without people knowing exactly what had happened to him and why, his reputation, his self-respect, everything. The night after the incident at the Cotton Club, Bumpy sat alone in his office above Small's Paradise. The office was exactly as he'd left it that morning. The desk was organized in the way that made sense only to him, with files and ledgers arranged in a pattern that looked random but contained a kind of logic that allowed him to find anything instantly. The walls were lined with photographs of him with important people: politicians, musicians, athletes, business owners, the photographic evidence that Bumpy Johnson mattered, that he was someone worth knowing, someone worth photographing with, someone whose friendship was valuable. Illinois Gordon had come and gone hours earlier, after the initial incident, after the beating. After Vincent had been helped to a taxi and sent on his way to the hospital, Duke Ellington had come and gone as well, had sat in that office drinking Bumpy's best scotch and playing records on the phonograph, had said very little but had communicated everything through his presence. The streets of Harlem were settling into their usual nighttime rhythm, the jazz clubs filling up, the hustlers taking to the corners, the night shift workers heading home from their jobs, the city moving into that liminal space between day and night where anything could happen and probably would. Bumpy poured himself a drink, a generous glass of aged bourbon that cost more than Vincent Caruso made in a month, and looked out the window at the city below. The lights of Harlem spread out beneath him like a map of his kingdom, like a visual representation of everything he'd built, and everything he'd protected, and everything he'd fought for. He thought about Vincent Caruso, about the kid's face in the moment before he'd rushed at Bumpy, about the expression of absolute confidence that had been there, the kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced real consequences. He thought about young men everywhere who thought they could take shortcuts to power, who thought they could use other people's respect to build their own without having to earn it themselves, who thought that the rules applied to everyone but them, who thought that having money or family connections or muscle somehow put them above the laws that governed everyone else. He thought about how many of those young men would see what happened to Vincent and still think they were different, still think they could be the exception, still think that they understood the game better than everyone who'd come before them. It was a pattern he'd seen 1,000 times. The young gangster who thought he was smarter than the old gangster, the ambitious kid who thought his family's reputation was enough to protect him, the connected guy who thought his connections meant he could do whatever he wanted, and he knew he'd see it 1,000 times more before he died, would have to deal with it, would have to respond to it, would have to make sure that the lesson was learned and that the system held firm. That was the burden of power in a place like Harlem. You couldn't just enforce the rules by being strong enough to defeat anyone who challenged you. You had to make people believe in the rules. You had to make them understand that every action had a consequence, and that consequences were absolute and undeniable. You had to be willing to be the instrument of that consequence, over and over again, forever, never allowing yourself a moment of weakness or hesitation. Bumpy finished his drink and set the glass down gently on the desk. Then he stood and walked to the window. He looked out at Harlem, the neighborhood that had made him, that had raised him, that had given him his education in the ways of power and respect, the neighborhood he'd devoted his entire life to protecting, that he'd defended against the Italians and the Colombians and anyone else who thought they could move in and take what belonged to the people who lived there, the neighborhood that would remember him long after he was gone, that would tell stories about him to their children and their grandchildren, that would use his name as shorthand for a kind of power that couldn't be understood unless you lived it. And in that moment, looking out at the streets and the buildings and the people, Bumpy Johnson understood something that most people never understand in their entire lives, something that would haunt him until his dying day. He understood that he would never be safe, not truly, not in any way that mattered. He understood that he would never be able to rest, never be able to simply enjoy what he'd built without having to defend it constantly, never be able to trust anyone completely because everyone was a potential threat, everyone was a potential betrayal waiting to happen. He understood that for as long as he lived, there would be young men like Vincent Caruso trying to prove themselves by disrespecting him, trying to use his authority to build their own, trying to find a shortcut to power that didn't require actually earning anything. And he would have to deal with every single one of them, just the way he'd dealt with Vincent, not out of cruelty, not out of any kind of sadistic pleasure in hurting people, but out of a kind of duty that couldn't be escaped, a responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders the moment he'd decided to become the protector of Harlem, the duty to maintain the system, the duty to protect his people, the duty to be better, smarter, and more brutal than anyone who challenged him. Because if he wasn't, if he ever showed weakness, if he ever let one disrespect slide without responding, if he ever allowed someone to challenge his authority and walk away without consequences, the entire structure would collapse, and then Harlem would belong to the wolves. The Italians would move in and take over the numbers racket. The Colombians would fight for territory. The young hustlers would start killing each other over nothing. The protection would disappear. The order would vanish. And Harlem would never be the same again. It would become just another ghetto, just another neighborhood where the strong preyed on the weak and nobody took care of anybody. And that was something Bumpy Johnson would never allow to happen. Not while he was still alive, not while he still had the strength and the intelligence and the will to fight. Bumpy Johnson lived another 11 years after the night he taught Vincent Caruso about respect. He spent those 11 years the same way he'd spent all the years before, running his operations, protecting his people, dealing with threats, eliminating competition, building alliances, playing the long game, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always understanding the larger patterns that other men couldn't see. Those 11 years were full of incidents and confrontations and situations that required the kind of intelligence and ruthlessness that only Bumpy possessed. But none of them would be remembered the way that the night at the Cotton Club was remembered. That night had become something mythological, something that transcended the specific event and became a symbol for the entire philosophy of Bumpy Johnson's reign. He died on July 7, 1968, in the same Cotton Club where he'd beaten Vincent nearly to death, in the same room where he'd sat at his usual table and drunk his cognac and conducted business as usual, while Vincent's blood dried on the floor. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the people of Harlem had a different way of remembering it, a different way of understanding what had actually happened that day. They said that Bumpy Johnson had finally allowed himself to die, that he'd spent his whole life maintaining order, maintaining the system, maintaining respect, and that by 1968 he was tired. Not physically tired, though he was that as well, but tired in the way that comes from carrying an impossible burden for so long that you forget what it was like to live without it. They said that when his heart finally gave out, it was almost like a relief, like he could finally put down the burden he'd been carrying since he was a young man, like he could finally rest, like he could finally stop fighting. Duke Ellington outlived Bumpy Johnson by only a few years, dying in 1974 at the age of 7. In the last interviews of his life, when people asked him about Bumpy Johnson, Duke would always say the same thing, with the kind of emphasis that made it clear he'd thought about this a lot, that it mattered to him deeply. He would say that Bumpy was the most intelligent man he ever knew, not the most talented, not the most charismatic, not the most powerful or the most feared, the most intelligent. He understood people the way a musician understands music, the way a composer understands harmony and melody and rhythm. He understood the ways they moved, the ways they thought, the ways they wanted to be treated. He understood that the greatest power in the world wasn't in being stronger than everyone else, wasn't in having more guns or more money or more soldiers. It was in being smarter. It was in seeing what was coming before anyone else could see it. It was in understanding human nature so completely that you could predict behavior and manipulate situations to your advantage. And then Duke would sit down at the piano, if one was available, and he would play. He would play the music that had defined his life and his legacy. And the music that came out would make people understand, without words, without explanation, what it meant to have been protected by someone like Bumpy Johnson. What it meant to have had someone stand between you and the wolves. What it meant to have had someone maintain order and respect in a world that was desperately trying to descend into chaos. People who heard Duke play in those final years said that the music was different than it had been before Bumpy died. It was sadder. It was deeper. It contained within it a kind of mourning for something that had been lost, something precious that couldn't be replaced or recovered. That was Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not the money he made, which was substantial, but ultimately just numbers on a ledger. Not the territory he controlled, which was important, but ultimately just physical space that could be taken by someone stronger. Not the battles he won, which were legendary, but ultimately just moments in time that faded into memory. His legacy was order. His legacy was respect. His legacy was the understanding that in a place like Harlem, in a time like 1957, those things mattered more than anything else. Those things mattered more than life itself. And if you didn't understand that, if you didn't respect that, if you thought that you could challenge that foundation without consequence, then you were going to learn it the hard way. You were going to learn it the way Vincent Caruso learned it. You were going to learn it with blood on your face and shame in your heart, remembering for the rest of your life the night you thought you could disrespect Duke Ellington and walk away unscathed. The night you learned that there was always someone smarter, always someone thinking 3 moves ahead. Because in Harlem, in the world that Bumpy Johnson had created and maintained for so many years, there was a natural law as immutable as gravity. There was always someone smarter. There was always someone seeing things that you couldn't see. There was always someone thinking 3 moves ahead while you were still trying to figure out what the first move was supposed to be. And that someone's name was Bumpy Johnson. And even after he was dead and gone, even after he'd been in the ground for decades, his name still meant something. His legacy still meant something. His lessons still meant something. Because you couldn't build something as powerful and as enduring as what Bumpy Johnson had built and have it simply disappear the moment you died. It persisted. It lived on through the stories that were told about him. It lived on through the understanding that respect was more important than power, that intelligence was more important than strength, that maintaining the system was more important than any individual human life, including your own.